I have kept this in my chest for 40 years, carried it the way you carry a stone in your boot, just present enough to remind you with every step that something is wrong. I am 79 years old. My hands are rough as bark. My back has ached since 1862. People look at me and see a woman who lived hard and endured. They are right. They just don't know what the hardest thing was. The mining, the cold, the hunger, the men who looked at me like I had no right to be there. Those things I can talk about freely. Those things made good stories. People leaned forward and said, "A woman, really?" And I said, "Yes, really," and felt the pride of someone who did something difficult and survived it. But there is one thing I don't tell at dinner tables. It sits in a different part of me than the rest, not in my pride where the hard memories live, but in the hollow place under my ribs where grief settled long ago and never lifted. I went to California in 1859, spent 12 years in the mining camps of the Sierra Nevada. I carried packs heavier than myself, slept on frozen ground, swung a pick, panned cold water with fingers that went numb by November and didn't come back until April. And I left something behind when I came east, something I would give everything I have left to go back and do differently. You can't prepare someone for that kind of regret, the kind built from a choice you made freely, with full knowledge, with sound reasons, the kind you can't blame on anyone else. That is the worst kind. I have had 40 years to learn that. I was born in Zanesville, Ohio, in the autumn of 1843. My father was a printer. He ran a small press, did broadsheets and handbills, and occasional runs of the local paper when the regular printer was ill. He was an educated man, more educated than most in our town, with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that were always slightly crooked, and an opinion on everything that had ever happened in the world. My mother was a school teacher before she married and kept the habit of reading long after, so our house had more books in it than most houses in Zanesville and a different kind of conversation at the dinner table. We talked about ideas. We talked about what was happening in the country. We talked about what was right and what was wrong and who was doing what about it. I grew up knowing that the world was larger than Zanesville, knowing there were places I had not been and things I had not seen, and that the not seeing was a kind of poverty, regardless of how comfortable our house was. My father had that restlessness in him, the printer's restlessness, always taking in information, always wanting more of it, always slightly dissatisfied with the size of the world he currently occupied. I inherited it from him. My mother used to say, I came out of the womb with my neck craning to see what was around the corner. She didn't mean it as a criticism. She understood it. She had the same quality herself, only she had learned to contain it within the boundaries a woman's life allowed. I was still young enough to believe those boundaries were negotiable. My older brother was named Daniel. He was 3 years ahead of me and had the same restlessness, same hunger for what was over the next ridge. When the California gold fever hit Ohio in 1849, he was 9 years old and already half mad to go. By the time he was 17 and I was 14, we were spending our evenings reading everything we could find about the camps, the newspapers, the pamphlets, the letters men sent home that made their way into print. Father would read them aloud at the table, his voice going dry and careful the way it did when something interested him intensely. He never said outright that he wanted to go, but we could all feel it, the way you feel a door in a wall before you find the handle. Daniel left for California in the spring of 1858. He was 18. Father was angry and sad and proud in equal measure, which is the particular combination fathers have when their sons do exactly what the fathers secretly wished they had the nerve to do themselves. Mother cried. I helped Daniel pack. He promised to write, and he did, faithfully, for the first year. His letters came from Sacramento, and then from a camp in the foothills he called Two Bear Creek, and then from another camp further north. They were full of cold and mud and failed sluices and men who had come to California expecting gold to simply be lying about on the ground and were learning differently. But they were also full of something else, a quality of being alive that his letters had never had before, a sharpness, a presence, like California had woken something in him that Zanesville had kept half asleep. I read those letters until the paper was soft from handling, read them in bed at night with a candle when everyone else was sleeping. I was 15, then 16, and the hunger that had always been in me was becoming something I couldn't manage anymore, couldn't fold back down into a shape that fit my ordinary days. Ohio was too small, not because there was anything wrong with Ohio, just because I had read Daniel's letters too many times and the California in my head had become something I needed to see with my own eyes, or I would always wonder. I would always be a woman who had stayed. I couldn't bear the thought of being a woman who had stayed. I left for California in April of 1859. I was 16 years old. I went with my father's blessing, which surprised everyone, including me. I had expected a fight, had prepared arguments, had rehearsed my case over several weeks, lying awake at night making and remaking the speech I intended to give. But when I finally said it, sat down at the breakfast table one Sunday morning and said, Father, I want to go to California to find Daniel, and I want your blessing, but I will go without it if I have to. He looked at me for a long moment over his crooked spectacles and said, I know, just that, I know, as though he had been waiting for me to say it out loud. Mother wept. She wept properly, fully, not hiding it. She held my face in both hands and looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, You are the most yourself person I have ever known, and I have loved you for it and been terrified of it in equal measure. I didn't fully understand what she meant until years later, until I had done enough things she would never have done and survived them, and come home changed in ways that made her go quiet sometimes when she looked at me. The terrified part she never stopped feeling. She just learned to hold it alongside the proud part without one destroying the other. I traveled with a family named Alderton who were going west by wagon, a respectable arrangement Father had arranged through contacts. The Aldertons were decent people, a husband and wife and 3 young children, practical and hard-working, and not especially interested in conversation, which suited me fine. I did not want conversation. I wanted to watch. The planes going on and on under a sky so large, it seemed less like weather and more like a state of mind. The mountains rising ahead of you day after day, growing slowly larger, and the air changing, getting thinner and sharper, and everything in you waking up in response to it. The sense of moving towards something, even the fear, and there was fear, real fear, the kind that keeps you honest, felt like proof that I was finally doing something that mattered. I found Daniel at Two Bear Creek in September of 1859, 5 months after leaving Ohio. He was 20 years old and looked 30, brown and lean and hard in the way men get when they live outside for a long time, with a beard he hadn't had when he left and eyes that had seen things he hadn't put in the letters. He held me at arm's length when he first saw me and just looked like he was checking whether I was real. Then he pulled me in and held me without saying anything for a long time. He smelled of wood smoke and river water and the mineral cold of the Sierra Nevada. He smelled like California. It is the smell I still associate with arriving somewhere that matters. I stayed at Two Bear Creek. Of course I stayed. The Aldertons went on south, and I stayed with Daniel and the 6 other men at his claim and began learning what mining actually was, as opposed to what I had read about it in letters. What it actually was work. Continuous, punishing, unglamorous work, done in water that was cold enough to make your hands stop being hands and become simply instruments you operated without feeling. The gold was there, it existed, but it existed in small quantities spread through enormous quantities of gravel and mud and cold water, and extracting it was a matter of moving enormous quantities of everything else aside to get at the small gold at the bottom. That was the reality, not the story. The story was glory. The reality was gravel. But I loved it. That is the thing I have to say plainly, because it matters to everything that comes after. I loved it with a completeness that surprised me and never really left. Loved the cold and the physical difficulty and the absolute democracy of the work, that the mountain did not care who you were or where you came from or what your father did, only whether you were willing to keep moving the gravel. Loved the camps themselves, the peculiar society of them, all those men from all those different places thrown together by a shared hunger and learning to make something like community out of it. Loved the sky at night above the Sierra, which was the most sky I had ever seen, more stars than I had imagined the universe contained. I loved all of it, even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts, if I am being fully honest. I was 16 years old and alive in a way I had never been alive, and I didn't know yet what any of it was going to cost me. I met Emmett Cole in the winter of 1860. He came to Two Bear Creek with 2 other men from Oregon who'd heard there was a new strike 3 miles north and stopped at our camp on the way to ask about it. He was 23 years old and from Pennsylvania originally, though he'd been in Oregon for 2 years before California. He was not the largest man in the camp, not the loudest, not the one who commanded attention when he walked into a place. He was the one sitting slightly to the side, watching, listening, asking questions that showed he'd been paying attention to the answers. He had gray eyes that went darker when something interested him, and a way of going absolutely still when he was thinking, like a hunting dog holding a point, everything concentrated and quiet. He spoke to me that first evening like I was a man, by which I mean he asked my opinion and waited for it, did not direct his questions to Daniel and listened for me to confirm or deny, looked directly at me and asked what I thought about the strike to the north, whether I thought it was worth the trip, what the gravel composition was like in this part of the creek. I told him what I actually thought, which was that the gravel was getting poorer and the creek was running too swift to be worth more than another season. He listened to all of it, nodded when he agreed, pushed back once when he didn't, with a quiet, specific reason. And when I answered the pushback, he thought about it and said, "That's fair. You're probably right." I had never had a man say that to me. Not like that. Not like it was just a simple fact that I had said a correct thing and been right about it, and he was acknowledging it the way you acknowledge any true statement from any person. Without surprise, without the particular patronizing warmth men use when a woman says something they weren't expecting to be useful. Just, "You're probably right." Like I was a person whose rightness was unremarkable. I thought about those 3 words for days afterward, turned them over, kept coming back to them. He and his partners went north. The strike turned out to be what I'd said it was, poor gravel, not worth the investment. He came back through our camp 6 weeks later, stopped, stayed 3 days. On the last evening, he sat with me by the fire after Daniel and the others had turned in and said without preamble that he was planning to stay in California, that there was ground further east that hadn't been properly worked yet, that he was looking for partners who knew what they were doing. He looked at me when he said that last part, not at the camp in general, at me specifically. I said I'd think about it. He nodded, said, "Don't think too long. Ground like that doesn't wait." He left the next morning. I spent 2 weeks thinking. Daniel told me I was already decided and just hadn't admitted it to myself yet. He was right. I was decided before Emmett Cole had finished his sentence. I was decided the moment he said, "You're probably right," and meant it. We worked together for 7 years. 7 years in the Eastern Sierra, in camps that had names and then didn't have names, in ground that yielded and then exhausted and sent you looking for the next ground. We were partners in the practical sense first. The 2 of us and 2 other men, working claims together, splitting what came out of the ground, making the 10,000 small daily decisions that mining required. Then we were partners in the way that happens when you work alongside someone in difficult conditions for long enough that the boundary between your thinking and theirs starts to blur. When you finish each other's sentences, not because you're showing off, but because you've been through enough together that your minds have worn grooves in the same places. He knew me. That is the simple version of it. He knew me in the way that is rarer than love and sometimes more important. He knew what I was actually like, not what I was supposed to be like. And he found what I was actually like sufficient, more than sufficient. He would watch me work, and there was nothing in his face that said, "This is surprising" or "This is impressive for a woman." Just the look a person has when they're watching something done well and taking satisfaction in it. I was 30 years old in the world before I understood what it was like to be known that way, before I understood what it cost to not be known that way. We were not together in the way people assume when I tell this story. Not at first. The camps were not safe for that kind of thing. Not then. Not with the kind of men who were there and the kind of talk that followed women who were known to be attached to a particular man. We were careful. Professional, you might say, though the word is strange, applied to 2 people living in a tent in the Sierra Nevada, eating salt pork and beans and panning creek gravel in November. But we were careful. For years we were careful. And underneath the carefulness, growing slowly the way things grow in cold climates, slowly but deep and tough when they finally come in, something else. He told me he loved me in 1866. We were at a camp near the Nevada border in late October, the first frost already on the ground and the season almost over. He said it simply, directly, without ceremony or decoration, the way he said everything. Said he had been not saying it for 3 years because he thought I might not want to hear it, that I might feel it complicated the partnership, that I valued the work over everything else, and he didn't want to be the thing that changed it. Said he was telling me now because he had spent 3 years being careful, and he was tired of being careful, and he thought if he waited any longer, one of them would die before the conversation happened, and he couldn't stand that possibility. I told him I knew, had known for at least 2 years. He looked at me for a moment, and then he laughed. That quiet, specific laugh he had, that sounded surprised by itself, said, "Why didn't you say something?" I told him the same reason he hadn't. Didn't want to complicate the work. Didn't know if what I felt was the kind of thing that survived outside the particular conditions that had grown it. Wasn't sure I could be a partner and a wife both, and I knew which one I couldn't give up. He said, "Who asked you to give anything up?" Nobody had ever said that to me before. Nobody had ever even thought to say it, that the two things could coexist, that loving him and being who I was could exist in the same life without one consuming the other. I sat with that for a long time. Felt it settle into me the way warmth settles into cold hands held over a fire, slowly, then suddenly all at once. But the choice was not as simple as that conversation made it sound. Nothing ever is. My mother wrote to me in the spring of 1867. She was ill, not the ordinary kind of ill that passes, the other kind, the settling kind, the kind that means something is ending. She didn't say it plainly. My mother was not a woman who said hard things plainly to the people she was trying to protect, but I could read it between the careful sentences. Could hear the things she wasn't saying underneath the things she was. Father was struggling. The printing business had gone badly for 2 years running. Daniel had come back from California with his health broken, something wrong with his lungs from years of wet cold. She needed me, not as a declaration, not as a demand. She wasn't the kind of woman to make demands. She just described the situation with that careful precision of hers and let me read what was in it. I sat with that letter for 4 days in which I did the work and ate the meals and said the ordinary things one says in a camp at the end of a season and thought about almost nothing else. I laid out the facts the way my father had taught me. Facts on one side, costs on the other. My mother was ill. My father needed help. Daniel was sick. They were my family. On the other side, Emmett. 7 years. The work we had built. What we had said to each other in October. What we had not yet fully become. I told Emmett on a Thursday evening. Told him what the letter said and what I had decided. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was his way. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the fire burned down between us and I fed it a piece of wood without either of us speaking. Then he said, "When?" I said spring, said I would go back in the spring when the passes cleared. He nodded, said, "For how long?" And that was the question, wasn't it? That was the one I hadn't answered even to myself. I said I didn't know. Said it depended on my mother, on my father, on Daniel's health. Said there were too many things I couldn't see from here. He nodded again, said, "Come back when you can." Said it plainly, not as a plea, not as a condition, just as a statement of what he wanted, offered without pressure, the way he offered everything. Come back when you can. I went back to Ohio in April of 1868. My mother was worse than her letters had suggested, thinner, moving carefully, the way people move when moving hurts. She held me a long time when I arrived. Didn't say anything, didn't need to. I moved back into my childhood room, which was smaller than I remembered, and began doing the things that needed doing. Cooking, cleaning, managing the household, sitting with my mother in the evenings, helping my father at the press when he needed an extra pair of hands, being useful, being a daughter, being the person I had left here 7 years ago and thought I had stopped being. I wrote to Emmett every week. He wrote back faithfully for the first year. His letters came from California, then from Nevada, then from Montana, where there was new country and new ground, and the kind of possibility that had always moved him forward. His letters sounded like him, careful, specific, present, saying what he meant without decoration. I read them the way I had read Daniel's letters in Ohio at 15, in bed at night by candlelight, until the paper went soft. My mother lived for 2 years after I came home. They were 2 years I do not regret, sitting with her in the evenings, talking more than we had talked in my whole childhood, the walls of propriety coming down between us as they do when someone is dying and both people know it and stop pretending otherwise. She told me about her life before she was my mother, about the girl she had been, about the things she had wanted and the things she had settled for and the things she was glad she'd chosen even when choosing them had cost her. She was 61 years old and dying and more honest than she had ever been, and I was grateful for every hour of it. She died in June of 1870. A quiet death in the morning, the windows open and the summer coming in. I held her hand. I was the one there at the end, and I am glad of that. Glad I was in that room and not 3,000 miles away in a mining camp in Montana. Whatever it cost me, I am glad of that specific thing. After the funeral, I stayed. Father was 70 and needed the help. Daniel's lungs were worse that year, bad enough that he couldn't work, and his wife had young children. I stayed because there was more to stay for than there had been reason to leave. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I would go back when things were more settled. I told myself Emmett would understand because he had always understood everything else. His letters grew less frequent in 1871, not stopped, less frequent. Once a month instead of every 2 weeks, then every 6 weeks. Still the same voice when they came, still careful and specific and present. But something in the gaps between them was saying what neither of us was saying directly, that time was making a decision we were failing to make ourselves, that the life you don't choose still gets chosen in the choosing of the days, that temporary, extended long enough, becomes permanent without anyone deciding it. A woman in Zanesville. I need to say this plainly because the truth requires it. Her name was Margaret Forsyth, a widow, 2 children, a decent woman by every measure I ever heard. Someone from my father's church. I heard about her from a friend of my mother's who mentioned it in the casual way people mention things they think are harmless. I hear Reverend Forsyth's widow has been keeping company with a man from out west, someone you might know, and the world went quiet in a very specific way. The way it goes quiet when you have been half expecting something and then it arrives and the half expecting doesn't protect you at all. I wrote to Emmett, asked him directly. He wrote back directly, which was the only way he knew to write. Said yes. Said he had met her the previous winter when he came through Zanesville on business. Said he had not planned it. Said he had waited for me for 3 years and had understood when I couldn't come and had kept waiting, but that waiting without a horizon is a different thing from waiting with one, and somewhere in the 3 years the horizon had disappeared. He was not cruel in the letter. He was not cold. He was simply honest, which is what he had always been, and honest was what I had always loved him for, and receiving honesty is different from loving the idea of it. He said, "I don't think you're coming back. I don't think you know that yet, but I think it's true, and I can't wait for a thing that neither of us will admit isn't coming." I put the letter down, looked at the room around me, the room I had grown up in, the familiar wallpaper, the familiar curtains, the familiar sounds of my father moving around in the kitchen below. I picked the letter back up, read it again, put it down again. Then I sat at the desk and wrote the response that had been the truth for 2 years and that I had been refusing to write. I told him I wasn't coming back, that he was right, that I had been lying to myself about the horizon, and it wasn't fair to him and it wasn't fair to either of us to keep the pretense up, that I hoped Margaret Forsythe knew what she had, that the 7 years we'd had were the realest years of my life, and I was grateful for every cold, terrible, beautiful day of them, that I was sorry I didn't have the courage to say this sooner, that I hoped he built something good. He married Margaret Forsythe in the spring of 1872. I heard about it from the same friend of my mother's who had first mentioned it, who delivered this piece of news with the same casual harmlessness, not knowing. I said, "Congratulations. I believe he is a good man." Then I went upstairs and sat on my bed and felt the full weight of what I had done. Not what had been done to me. What I had done, the distinction matters. This was my choice, made freely, with reasons. The reasons were still sound. The heart doesn't care about sound reasoning. That is the thing nobody tells you. I married a man named Arthur Gillespie in 1874. He was a decent man, a hardware merchant, steady, honest, kind in the undemanding way of men who are not complicated. He knew I had been in California, that I had done unusual things, that I was not a conventional woman. He seemed to find this interesting rather than troubling, at least at first. He was not Emmett Cole. He couldn't have been. Nobody else was going to be Emmett Cole, and I knew that when I married Arthur, and I married him anyway, which is either wisdom or resignation, depending on the day you ask me about it. We had 2 children, a boy named Joseph and a girl named Clara. They were good children, healthy and bright, and I loved them with everything I had. I made sure of that. Whatever I could not give Arthur, the complete presence, the depth of knowing, the thing I had had once and lost, I gave to my children without reservation, Clara in particular. Clara was like me in ways I recognized from the inside, that craning quality, that hunger for what was over the next ridge. I did not try to contain it in her the way it had been contained in me. I told her about California, told her about Two Bear Creek and the cold and the stars and what the work felt like when you were doing it right. I told her that the world was larger than whatever town she was in, and that the not seeing was a kind of poverty, and that she had every right to go and look. She went in the end. Not to a mining camp. Those were done by then, the easy gold long since gone. But she went, became a school teacher in Colorado, and then a newspaper writer, and then something I can only describe as a woman who took up space the way she was entitled to and didn't apologize for it. She married a man who said you're probably right when she was right, which is the thing I told her to look for. She found it. I am more grateful for that than I can say. Arthur died in 1901, quietly, without drama, of a heart that had simply finished. I mourned him honestly, not with the depth I would have mourned Emmett, but honestly. He had been a good man and a faithful husband, and he had never understood me fully, and had been patient about not understanding, which is its own kind of generosity. I heard about Emmett Cole for the last time in 1903, a letter from a man who had worked with us at Two Bear Creek, an old man by then, who tracked me down to let me know. Emmett had died in Montana the previous winter. He was 60 years old. He had built a good life, a ranch, cattle, land he had worked and paid for and owned outright. He and Margaret had had 4 children. He had died with his family around him. He had died well, by all accounts. The man who wrote to me said he had never forgotten his California years and had spoken of them with fondness until the end. I sat with that letter in my kitchen in Ohio for a long time, let it mean what it meant, felt the loss of him, not fresh, not sharp, but deep, the deep ache of something that had been a part of you for 40 years and now was formally, finally gone. I had lost him in 1871 when I wrote that letter, but there is a difference between losing someone and knowing they're dead, and the difference is larger than you expect. I thought about what his life had been, what mine had been. 2 parallel lives that had been one life for 7 years and then separated and run alongside each other for 40 more without touching. He had built something good. I had built something real. We had both survived. The reasoning had been sound. I am 79 years old now, and I still wake some mornings with the smell of California on me, creek water and wood smoke and the mineral cold of the Sierra. It fades by the time I'm fully awake, but for those first few seconds it is entirely present, entirely real, and I am 30 years old again and alive in a way that the rest of my life has not quite managed to replicate. I have thought about this for 40 years, turned it every direction a thought can be turned, asked myself every question a person can ask. Was I right to stay? Was I right to go in the first place? Could I have done something differently that would have changed the ending? Or is the ending the one that was always coming, given who I was and who he was and what the world required of both of us? The honest answer is, I don't know. I have never known. That is a particular texture of this regret. Not the clean grief of a loss that was imposed on you, but the murkier grief of a loss you participated in. A loss you made with both hands with sound reasons and have been paying for ever since. My daughter Clara asked me once when she was grown whether I ever wished I had stayed in California. We were sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, the light going golden the way it does in Ohio summers, and the question came out of nowhere, or seemed to. I think she had been building toward it for years. Clara has always been a person who asks the direct question when other people are still dancing around the edges of it. I told her the truth, told her about Emmett, about the 7 years, about the letter I wrote in 1871 and the choice it represented and what it had cost me. I had never told anyone before, not the full version, not without leaving out the parts that were most painful. She listened the way he used to listen, completely, without interrupting, with her full attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Do you regret it?" I told her yes and no. Yes, because the loss of him was real and permanent, and the reasoning I had used to justify it has never fully convinced my heart, even when it convinced my head. No, because the staying produced real things. My father's last years with someone beside him. Daniel's children, who needed their aunt when Daniel died young, as he did at 44, his lungs finally finished. Clara herself. Joseph, who has 3 children of his own now, and a steady life I take genuine satisfaction in. The life I built in Ohio was a real life. It produced real things, real love. I did not waste it. But the question she actually asked was not whether the staying produced good things. The question was whether I regretted it. And the answer to that specific question, the honest answer after 40 years of carrying the stone in the boot, is yes. I regret the way I did it, the slowness of it, the 3 years of pretending the horizon was still there when I already knew it wasn't, the cowardice of letting time make the decision rather than making it myself, and releasing him from the waiting while there was still enough time for both of us to build something deliberately. If I had told the truth in 1869 instead of 1871, he would have had 2 more years. We both would have. 2 more years to grieve it properly and then go forward with our eyes open instead of half shut. That is what I regret, not the choice itself, the way I made it. The slow, silent way I let it happen to both of us rather than choosing it directly and honestly and saying out loud, "This is what I have decided. This is what I am giving up. These are the reasons now both of us can know." The reasoning was always sound, but I could have been kinder in the delivery of it. I could have been braver. I could have been more like him, who told the truth plainly and directly and without waiting for time to make it easier. I will die with this. That is simply the truth. I am 79 years old, and my heart is doing uncertain things, and the doctor speaks to me in the careful tone doctors use when they are managing expectations. I will die with this, and it will be all right. Regret does not have to be resolved to be bearable. You don't have to make peace with everything you have done wrong to live a life that was worth living. You just have to be honest about it. That is all I know to tell you. If I could go back to that spring in 1868, if I could stand at the moment when I was packing to leave California and Emmett was standing in the door of the tent watching me with those quiet gray eyes, I would say this. I would say I love you and I have to go and I am not coming back. I would say it cleanly, directly, with no horizon attached. I would say, "You have been the best partner I have ever had in every sense of that word, and the 7 years we built together are the best years of my life, and I am choosing Ohio because my family needs me and because it turns out I am a daughter before I am a minor, and I am sorry for what that costs you and what it costs me. Go find your life. Don't wait. Come back to this in 20 years and be proud of what you built without me. I would not have tried to leave the door open. That is what I would have done differently. I would have closed it properly with both hands and let us both walk away from it in full knowledge of what we were walking away from. Instead, I spent 3 years holding the handle and telling us both I was still deciding. 3 years in which he could not go forward fully and I could not come back fully, and neither of us built what we might have built if we'd simply known the truth. That is the waste. That is the thing I cannot fix, not the loss itself. The slow, dishonest way I let the loss happen. I am telling you this now because I couldn't tell it before, couldn't find the words for 40 years, or found them and swallowed them, which amounts to the same thing. There is something about being this close to dying that removes the usefulness of silence. What am I protecting now? Who am I sparing? The man is 40 years dead. The woman I was is almost as far gone. There is nothing left to lose by saying it plainly. I went to California at 16 and found gold, and found a partner, and found the version of myself that I loved most. And then I left and came back to Ohio and did my duty and raised good children and lived a real life. And it was enough mostly, by most measures, on most days. But I left something in a mining camp in the Sierra Nevada in 1868 that I never fully got back. Something that had no name. Something that lives in the hollow place under my ribs on mornings when I wake up smelling creek water and wood smoke. Something that a person only gets one of, and I spent mine carefully and honestly and with sound reasons. And the sound reasons were always true, and they were never enough. That is my regret, the one real one, the one that never softened, the one I am putting down here, finally, at the end, because I am tired of carrying it, and I cannot take it with me, and someone ought to know it was real. That is my greatest failure, that I waited so long to say it, that I let the silence win for 40 years, too late to matter, too late to change, but said, finally said, too late, always too late.